So this is the second week of our series on the good news of being Presbyterian. If you were here last week, we wanted to point out right off the bat that we're not trying to convince anyone of anything. We're not trying to convert you to anything. I'm just trying for a few weeks to clarify a bit about the tradition which this church has been part of for over 100 years. And I'm trying to witness to the insights about God that Presbyterians have had for about 500 years. So we also pointed out right at the bat that relationships with people in this kind of a church right now, those are at least as important as any of the ideas, any of the feelings, any of the traditions that have grown out of our history as a church. And the community that you cultivate in these very pews, in that fellowship, that community matters a lot more than any nonsense that I say up here on any given Sunday morning. So if I'm ever unclear from here, when I'm trying to teach about God or Bible or faith or Jesus or predestination, if I'm ever unclear, don't let that get in the way of your growing together as a church and growing together with God. For instance, last week, I was trying to make a point that Presbyterians tend to think God deals with all of us, in this one kind of category of people who make mistakes. I was trying to make this point that Presbyterians tend to deny the idea that we can ever be good enough to earn God's love or bad enough to lose God's love. And I was trying to say we're all just a little imperfect, and Presbyterians tend to think that God is in the business of reaching out to imperfect people. I tried to make that point, but my metaphor to explain it involved a bottle of water and bird poop. Which they don't teach you in preaching school to use bird poop. But so if you missed that, go listen online. It's really exciting. This week, no poop metaphors, best I can. Instead, we're just going to get right to the point with some advice from John Calvin. Very serious guy. He's the founder of the Presbyterian tradition. He's very strict. He would never put up with my middle school maturity. And this is what he says to preachers about explaining really difficult concepts in church. He has a big, long beard, very austere guy, and he says, I consider looseness with words no less of a defect than looseness of the bowels. Going right to the source. What'd you learn in church today? I don't know. But as ridiculous as that quote sounds, I think Calvin is on to something, because for the conversations I've had the last few weeks about this series we're doing, we've been building up to this series, and I've been hearing people left and right, over and over, speaking very loosely with the words predestination and predetermined. The first one, predestination, that's often associated with Presbyterians. And if we're going to preach anything about the good news of Presbyterians, we need to get precise about what that means. So predestination, predetermination. The second one, predetermination, is a fun, philosophical kind of game. It asks questions like, am I free to drop this water bottle? Are you free to scratch your nose? Let's see who scratches their nose now. Yeah, there's one right there. Basically, the issue for predetermination is, what is the relationship between my actions and their causes? What's the relationship there? People who care about predetermination, they don't care about the results of my actions. They don't care about the value that my actions hold. They don't care about the meaning that imparts or theological implications in there. The question is, are my actions determined by something? Genetics, experience, nature, whatever it might be. Or do I have something like free will that lets me choose one way or the other? Or maybe I'm predetermined to make choices, or maybe I choose to be predetermined, even though those choices are free. Or maybe I'm just predetermined to stop talking about predetermination because it has nothing to do with the good news of Presbyterianism. But it might have a little something to do with God and faith, but it has nothing to do with our Presbyterian tradition. And if we're going to get our words and ideas clear, we just have to get rid of that word, predetermination. Especially for a Presbyterian geek like me, when I hear that kind of word, I just want to read inappropriate quotes from John Calvin to kind of bring it home. The other word that I do want to talk about is predestination. Say it with me. Predestination. It's a beautiful word. You don't even have to know what it means or believe in it. It has a ring to it. But what it means, it has nothing to do with your normal actions. It has nothing to do with how your actions come about, whether I drop water, scratch your nose, any of that stuff. Instead, predestination, as Calvin handed it down to us, is about the relationship between God and our most ultimate destiny in life. It's a tricky kind of sentence, so let's hit that again. Predestination, as Calvin handed it down to us, is about the relationship between God and our most ultimate destiny. Does my dropping a water bottle have anything to do with my salvation? Hope not. Your scratching your nose have anything to do with your ultimate destiny? Kind of doubt it. And from last week, for those of you who paid really close attention to last week's kind of message, do Presbyterians tend to believe that any of our actions, moral or amoral, good or bad, does anything we do twist God's arm into valuing us one way or another? No. The concept of grace, as Presbyterians tend to understand it, means that you matter because God says you matter, not simply because of the things you do. So your ultimate significance, the purpose for which you're created, your destiny, in the way we use that word, that's all in God's hands, not in your hands. Hence, predestination. So you can call it heaven, you can call it hell, salvation, damnation, election, chosen, all those other kinds of words get thrown around in there. But when we use the word destiny, what we mean is it's far more than any collection of the things you do. The whole is greater than the parts of your actions. Your destiny is wrapped up in a purpose-filled, meaningful expression of your place in a huge world. Your destiny is about how you fit into God's great plan. Now, if your whole life is just distant from God, God's over there and you're way over there, if your whole life just doesn't impact anything at all in creation, maybe you don't have a destiny. Okay. If your whole life is just so chaotic and so empty that not even God could sneak in there and find some way to use you for a greater good, maybe you're destined to just be cut off from anything of value. But if you take the good and the bad in your life, if you take the painful and the joyous, the mundane, the amazing things you do, if your life just shapes anything about the world in any way, that might just fit into God's plan. And if it fits into God's plan, that's what we call, as Presbyterians, we tend to call that a destiny. Or at least maybe God is able to use all of that chaotic part of your life and point it back to some eternal value. A friend of mine, he's a crazy one of these boulder types, and he was hiking up Long's Peak last week. I think it was Saturday. He was going up there, and it's kind of snowy up there, kind of dangerous. He hiked up to Chasm Lake, and then he put on all the gear, and he climbed up halfway up to the Diamond at Long's Peak in the freezing cold, which is ridiculous. He's got a great picture, but he lost his way on the way down. Put the snowshoes back on, walking down, and got lost. And the snow started coming in, the dark started coming in, the headlamp was kind of flickering in the snow, and he was completely wandering down paths that were not the main trail. And eventually, he was getting a little scared and thinking he might have to do a snow cave or something, and fortunately, good job on him, he snuck out of that one. And he ran into the trail. He ran into the stream and was able to get down, all safe and sound, and his girlfriend could call off the search parties and everything. Now, in our lives, whatever astounding and impressive things you do, whether you're climbing Long's Peak or being a mom or being part of a community, whatever that is, we stumble off the path sometimes. And whether you find your own way back and travel on towards some purpose, or whether God finds a new path for you to bring you on to some greater plan, Presbyterians tend to think that God can use and does use all of our successes and all of our failures to build towards some kingdom that's far bigger than simply the sum of your actions. Again, Presbyterians tend to think that God has this ability and actually does come into our life, takes our successes, takes our failures, and builds off of those, something that he calls the kingdom of heaven. And so if you think that God is a good God, if you think that God is working to point the world toward love, and if you think God is sovereign enough to use you for that, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the good news of predestination. It's about God's grace making your life something more valuable. And yet there are objections. I think there are about 4 ways that people really struggle with this idea. First one, you might say, God might do or proclaim whatever God does or proclaim, but shouldn't I have some control over my destiny? Shouldn't I be able to determine the end and purpose of my life? See what I did there? The determine? That's what we say all the time. Shouldn't I be able to have control over that? People, they love to mix up the causes and the values because we love to have control. We love this illusion of trusting ourselves. When I was in kindergarten, full of illusions, I tried to do something that a lot of kids try to do. Some of you will relate to this. I went to the stuff drawer in the kitchen. You've all got a stuff drawer. And I pulled it out, a pair of scissors in there. And I walked into the living room. And I sat on the big chair. And I got those scissors out. I could barely hold them. Didn't have a mirror. Just started cutting that hair. Just going at it. Who's done it here? Anyone? Yeah, Trace, yep. Yeah, I didn't stop to think of the consequences. I had no training. I could barely hold the scissors. I didn't consult anyone. I just started snipping away. Nowadays, I trust Robin over at Mountain Rose. I trust her to cut my hair. Got it yesterday. Not too bad, I think. She does a good job. But I shudder to think how often, in so many of my decisions, how often I rely on my own efforts. No preparation, no expertise, a clear pattern of stumbling, without ever thinking about the consequences. And how rarely do I consult other people or God? We love control and we love trusting ourselves, that when we move past haircuts and we move past the regular parts of life, and when we move past even the big decisions of our life, and when it comes to the deepest, ultimate significance of your entire life, who do you trust more to make you worthwhile? Do you trust you or do you trust God? Presbyterians tend to think that we have a better chance by putting our faith in God than by putting our faith in ourselves. But a lot of people will say, okay. God offers grace, but we have to accept it. This guy Arminius, he bugged Calvin about this. He kept writing letters. Oh, we have to accept our grace. He was a puny chicken of a man. And Calvin's response went something like this. He said, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what this acceptance thing is. I don't know what it means that God might dangle this carrot of salvation. And I don't know what sort of God would hold us hostage. And I don't even know what kind of God would come down and die on a cross just for the chance that you might accept something. And really, it comes down, I don't even know what accept means. What does accept mean in this kind of thing? Sure sounds like God's just acting like a middle manager with his little checklist, just checking to see if we've accepted something, whatever that is. Did you accept strong enough this morning? Did you accept worthy enough this morning? Sounds like loose language to me, which is Presbyterian for saying it's full of loose things. But of course, you can live out your value into God's grace. There's something beautiful about a life that accepts one's destiny, whatever that means. But Presbyterians tend to remind us that God is the prime mover here. And thank goodness that we don't have to rely on our own selves. A third objection. People say predestination just isn't fair. Just not fair. God might predestine me to hell. To which I respond, have you been listening? No one said anything about hell. God is in the business of grace. God is in the business of redeeming all of creation. Calvin, we're taking a lot of this from him. I have to admit, he wasn't all the way past this idea that God might choose people and send them to damnation or whatever you want to call it. But really, no one in the 1500s could fathom the idea that God's love might really be for everyone. In fact, no one in the 1500s could fathom genetics. No one in the 1500s could fathom electricity. No one in the 1500s really knew anything about how to do, heart surgery. And now, we don't understand everything about DNA, but we trust that it explains a lot about us. And some of you can wire things everywhere, but I don't have a clue what electricity really is or what really happens in that whole process. And, surgery's scary, but we rely on it a lot. We go in there and we pray, and we put ourselves in the hands, and we put ourselves vulnerable to the doctor. Presbyterians are not saying that we fully understand how God works, but more and more often these days, we are landing on the idea and the feeling that God is about love for everyone, really everyone, and has planned a world where you're part of that story. More and more, we trust in a God who's just too awesome to be fair. The fourth objection, people will say, awesome, I'm predestined. I'm going to hang out and not respond and do no service and not come to church. I'm predestined. It's all good. Well, that's next week's sermon. For this week, let's close by singing, it's kind of tricky. Mighty Fortress is Our God. First two verses are in your hymnal. Second two verses are in your bulletin.